yesterday's news.
Hello, welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday, or yesteryear, if you will. This week, floods. There was something in the Manx radio news stream recently saying it was 6 years since the terrible flooding in Laxey, and whilst insurance issues were improving, it seems, I dare say some people, it doesn't seem that far away. Which made me think about flooding on the Isle of Man. Happily, we don't see it too often, thank the Lord. But often enough, it seems, if you look in the papers, and some pretty bad ones. At that, I take you to the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, December the 28th, 1901. The floods of the 18th of October and the 12th and 13th of November is the article in the Times. Two such heavy floods as those of the 18th of October and the 12th and 13th of November have rarely followed each other at so short an interval, the writer says. The first flood is said to have been the heaviest for 29 years, and the second was scarcely, if at all, less heavy. And yet in the first flood the rainfall was comparatively small and fell in a few hours, and in the second the rainfall extraordinarily large and lasted for many hours. The comparative amounts of rain will be seen from the following figures. At Ingebrek, 1.78 inches fell during the first flood and 3.82 during the second. The corresponding figures at the Clips were 0.85 and 4.68 inches. 4.5 inches or more of rain, goodness me. At Cronkbourne, 0.96 and 4.21 inches. In Douglas at Woodville, 0.92 and 3.33 inches. At Santon Vicarage, 1.61 and 2.57 inches. And during the second flood, the extraordinary rainfall of 5.68 inches fell at St Luke's Parsonage in Baldwin. I was there only the other week. Happily, it wasn't washed away. How, then, are we to account, the writer goes on, for the floods being similar in amount? I think I shall have no difficulty in showing that the earlier flood was probably caused by a cloudburst or bursts. In the first place, the rainfall on the 18th of October varied greatly in different parts of the island. Thus, at the Point of Ayre, where the average rainfall is not much more than half that in Douglas, 1.5 inches fell, whereas in Douglas only 0.92 inches were recorded. Cronkbourne having 0.96 inches, the Clips 0.85 inches, Santon Vicarage 1.61 inches. At Ingebrek, the self-recording gauge just above Ingebrek House gave 1.78 inches, while the gauge on the summit of Colden had about 2.38 inches. That near Slue Maggle around 2.6 inches, and that near Carrigan 1.55 inches. These figures, the writer says, would appear to indicate that the centre of the cloudburst was on Slue Maggle, but judging by the way the roads were torn up about, there must also have been very heavy rainfalls in both Crannock, Sobiglen and near South Barule. We move to Friday, March the 4th, 1910, in the Ramsey Courier. Disastrous floods, we read. Heavy floods of a disastrous nature have visited the island during the week. The country about Ramsey in the north has never, it is stated, been in such a state, and agriculturalists fear that unless the drying March winds present themselves very soon, the sowing season will be kept back. Wednesday night saw the heaviest downfall of rain that's been experienced for many a year, and next morning hundreds of acres of land were submerged, the depth of water in places being several feet. Thus the land, unless very favourable weather intervenes, is likely to remain waterlogged for a considerable time. Sulby River rose, it's estimated, about 7 feet, and at various places entered farmhouses and residences, including Mr. J. G. Elliott's house at Laxey and Lochen Ie house. It being the lambing season, the floods have been peculiarly oppressive for the sheep, and it's feared a number of sheep and lambs have suffered, the bodies of a few being washed down the river on Thursday. On the railway line, Lochen Ie Bridge was overwhelmed, but the company, since the last severe flood, which dislocated the traffic on the lines, have constructed culverts at different parts, and these avoid the line being blocked. Well, they were thinking ahead at least. In the Examiner, Friday, October the 31st, Optune, 1930. And we're into Laxey again. Laxey floods lawsuit. This is all sounding a bit familiar, isn't it? Highway Board proceed against Manx Electric Railway. MER blamed for choking up of river, ever-present danger to life and property. It's actually chocking up is what the word says, but either would do, I suppose. Terrible experience of flood victims. It's a long article. I'll just give you a sample of it as it goes into quite a lot of legal detail. An important legal action, the nature of which imputes the defendants in the action in a large share of responsibility for the serious damage caused by the recent floods in Laxey Glen district, was begun before Deemster Lamoth at Douglas on Wednesday. The action was brought by the Highway Board against the Manx Electric Railway Company Limited to compel the defendant company to remove a quantity of debris now lying in the Laxey Glen River and to take the necessary steps to prevent any accumulation of debris in the riverbed in future. The Attorney General, assisted by Mr E. W. Farger, is conducting the case for plaintiffs, and Mr W. P. Cowley, assisted by Mr S. J. Neal, appears for the MER. At the commencement of the action, the Attorney General said there was every prospect of it lasting a very considerable time, and it seems likely to engage the attention of the court for a much longer period even than the now celebrated Glen Helen case, in which the Highway Board are defendants. The same small army of experts that gave evidence in the Glen Helen case has been mobilised to take part in this case, and a well-constructed model of the locus showing the river roadway, a weir with sluices and various devices set out in detail, and particular physical features of the riverbed was mounted up on a large table in the centre of the timbered chamber where the court sat. Many of those who were victims of the flood are included among the witnesses to be called, and some of the oldest inhabitants of the village are giving evidence of the conditions in and about the Glen River half a century ago. So that would be in the 1880s or thereabouts. That article, as I say, goes on for quite some time. The Ramsey Courier, Friday, November the 27th, 1931. Severe floods damage at Glen Alden and Blua Glen, we read. Roads impassable, houses flooded. Damage to property and land, and landslides and widespread flooding were caused in many parts of the north of the Isle of Man as a result of Monday's torrential rain. The deluge could hardly be described as a rainstorm. It was not of comparatively short duration, as was the case in September 1930, but the rain simply teemed down all day on Monday without the slightest break of any kind. The riverbeds and banks, still unrepaired following the great floods of 1930, were unable to cope with the abnormal volume of water, and the water overflowed the banks in many parts and flooded the surrounding land. So far as damage to property was concerned, Glen Alden was again the worst sufferer, and this renowned beauty spot on Tuesday presented a rain-soaked and desolate appearance. The residents of Glen Alden have suffered greatly in consequence of the havoc wrought by flooding during the last winter and the present winter so far as it has gone. The 1930 flood is still a vivid memory with the people living there, and when the rain fell such as we experienced on Monday, they are in dread lest their homes and all their belongings will be swept away from them and their very lives may be in peril. Although it is over a year since the catastrophe occurred in the Glen, which caused such great damage, steps are only being taken now to make a reoccurrence of the disaster less likely. Over a year has been spent in taking and arguing about the subject, and the danger to Glen residents is as great today as it was 12 months ago. Slightly worrying to think that was 90 years ago, and we seem to be having similar arguments now, don't we? On a happier note, in 1949, the Mona's Herald, Tuesday, August the 9th, something of a different flood, perhaps a flood that people would welcome. Beer floods Douglas Street, we read. Copious streams of good Manx bitter beer flooded the roadway and gutters in Wellington Street and Strand Street yesterday afternoon, and hundreds of visitors in this congested shopping centre stood watching with envious eyes as gallons of the popular beverage flowed swiftly down the street. Some bent down and dipped their fingers into the liquid, then gingerly tasted the tips to test if it was really true. It was quite true. The flood was let loose when 4 brewers' men were unloading a lorry halfway up the street, and a 54-gallon cask full of bitter beer suddenly collapsed, and its contents cascaded all over the road. To the best of my knowledge, the only beer flood in the Isle of Man. Perhaps you were there. Let me know if you were. Howard Kane at manxradio.com. Kane with an E. I don't know what age you would have been, though. In the Times, Saturday, September the 9th, 1950, back to just rain floods. Floods in the west. The floods in the River Neb and down Peel Harbour were greater than seen for many years, the dirty brown-coloured water discolouring most of the bay. The fishing boats had a harbour night, and large stream trawlers came into the breakwater for shelter. A trip by car around the roads in the west saw floods everywhere. At Glenfaber, the river burst its banks and flooded the low-lying field, and the same thing happened at the Ragged Corner. Here, the river, the Peel side of the Red Dub, was a raging torrent, and there was a huge lake where the course of the river has recently been altered. This was apparently nature's way of saying she would stand no interference. There were branches and bits of trees all over the roads, especially between Patrick and St John's, and at Cronkbreck, Grebe, workmen were busy clearing the road where a large tree had been blown down. All sounds quite familiar from Storm Amy, I think, doesn't it? And finally, 1958 in the Times, Friday, September the 19th. Shops are flooded, we hear. A sudden deluge of rain which fell around 1 p.m. on Monday caused flooding in 2 shops in Douglas. The fire brigade was called to give assistance at the grocer's shops of Messrs A.B. Henry & Son, 61 Bucks Road, where water poured into the cellar and flooded it to a depth of about 2 feet. Fortunately, the stock which was stored in the cellar was on raised shelves and little damage was done. The shopkeeper was thinking ahead. The brigade pumped the water away. Cause of the flooding was a drain backing up with the sudden weight of water. There was also some flooding in the basement of Sales Drapers in Victoria Street. It was not serious, no damage was caused. The downpour of rain lasted about half an hour and appears to have been limited to Lower Douglas. Very typical of the island, that, isn't it? In Upper Douglas it was not so heavy, and other parts of the island there was no rain at all. In the south it was reported the sun was shining all that time. At the bottom of that article it also just says, electricity is our best servant, but I don't know if that's leading on to something else. It is true, isn't it, how you get microclimates on the Isle of Man. I'm thinking of my own experience of 2013 when at Cronkavoddy the entire house was submerged in snow, and if you went a little bit further south there wasn't a flake of snow to be seen. Whichever way you look at it, floods and bad weather have always been news on the Isle of Man, now and of course old news. Cheerio.
You're gonna be yesterday's news.